Hi, everybody. This is Lee. And I've spoken a lot about the Green New Deal with this video. The way people have learned to make something out of nothing, reducing, reusing, recycling, and then also emphasis on renewable energy, clean energy, organic agricultural practices, focus on infrastructure, things like this. And it seems like innovative kind of public policy. But the thing is, the Green New Deal has already been done in the United States. Um, People in the Great Depression uh, had to use a type of Green New Deal in terms of making something out of nothing, reducing, reusing, recycling. There was wartime rationing. There was also residual economic fallout from the Great Depression. People had to learn how to make do with what they had and to make dollars stretch and learn how to rig up systems in order to carry out activities at home. And so Cuba has been doing that for some time now. And so that's what this video is about. Fidel Castro, Cuba, and then the fact that our grandparents, our great grandparents, have learned how to do already what Cuba has been doing, and that maybe there are lessons for all of us. But anyway, this video is about Fidel Castro. Many people consider him a working class hero. I'm looking at two articles. One is a eulogy for Fidel Castro. This is by Danny Heffon. That was written for the Black Agenda Report. And then there's another article, History Will Be the Judge, Fidel Castro, 1926 to 2016. And that's for Counterpunch. And so Fidel Castro has been characterized in many ways, depending on who's doing the characterizing, who's writing the history. In many respects, Fidel Castro was seen as a working class hero. Prior to 1959, Cuba was ruled by a dictatorship, an oligarchy. It was very divided by class, neocolonialism and imperialism. It was a military state by Batista, and the Batista oligarchy siphoned off Cuba's wealth from the 99% upward to the 1%. To a few U.S. corporations. And so the Cuban majority at that time, prior to 1959, were peasants. They were worker populations, and they were afflicted with illiteracy, extreme poverty, and then also racism. And so there was the uprising in 1953, and that was where Fidel Castro, who was a lawyer at the time, rose up to fight against that oligarchy. He was in prison, and then he was released and he fled to Mexico. And in Mexico, he stayed at the hacienda that Emiliano Zapata stayed at for a time. And then in November 1956, Fidel Castro actually returned to Cuba with Che Guevara, and they fought their way towards the capital, and they managed to overthrow the oligarchy. They were successful in that endeavor. And then the U.S. responded by trying to cut off Cuba from support. And then Cuba responded by nationalizing U.S. corporate holdings inside Cuba without compensation. And so the U.S. responded with the Bay of Pigs endeavor. John F. Kennedy sent troops to land on Cuban shores and try to retake Cuba. They were defeated. And so there's been an economic blockade against Cuba by the U.S. ever since. And so that brings us here today. But in the meantime, even though Cuba was cut off by the U.S. From economic trade and support from other nations, USSR reached out to Cuba and kept them afloat until the USSR fell. And then Cuba was basically a standalone nation, they had to figure out how to make do with what they had because of the economic blockade and the inability of getting another nation to sponsor them. Maintaining their own independence, they had to become self determined and self dependent. And they managed to do that. Even today, Cuba has managed to provide free healthcare to all of its citizens, which means that they have an extremely high literacy rate in Cuba. Cuba also provides free healthcare to all of its citizens, which means that Cuba has an extremely low infant mortality rate. In fact, their rate of infant mortality is lower than the United States. There's virtually no homelessness, virtually no unemployment, certainly no malnutrition. Everyone eats, everyone works, everyone gets an education, and then everyone also has free health care. There's been a redistribution of wealth and political power from the 1% back to the 99%. And so this is a lot of success domestically. They've made strides in agriculture. They've managed to somewhat stave off the crumbling of their infrastructure. It has crumbled just throughout time, from time, but they've managed to do workarounds and rigging up of structures to make it possible for transportation and things like that. So that's domestically. Internationally, Cuba has also contributed to the world stage. They've assisted Vietnamese during their fights against imperialism. They've assisted South Africa in their fight against apartheid. They've also assisted Angola and Namibia to throw off colonialism and imperialism from European nations. They sent troops. Um, let's see. The United Nations, Mexico, Caribbean nations, African nations, most of South Africa have rejected the U.S. embargo against Cuba. So Cuba does enjoy international relations. Even Canada recognizes Cuba and trades with Cuba. It's the United States that's kind of isolated in this embargo against Cuba. Also, Cuba has also assisted in protection of Black revolutionaries who fled the United States, such as Assata Shakur and Huey Newton, Robert Williams. So people view Cuba in different ways. Um, for many people in the United States who've been subjected to media propaganda, psychological warfare, manipulation, the view of Cuba is skewed. But I think it's worthwhile to actually do your own research, to read alternative, independent, perhaps progressive media resources to find out for yourself what Cuba means, what it has meant, certainly the life of Fidel Castro and his legacy that he has provided for the world to see, the role modeling, the success of Cuba. I think it's significant, the life of Fidel Castro and what it has meant to other world leaders. Um, I'd like to say that Cuba is an interesting place. If you can travel there, I think it's worthwhile to see for yourself. And then you be the judge. History will be the judge, but you can also judge yourself what Fidel Castro meant and what Cuba means today. Good luck.